was I just returned from a gay bar in Soho when the Taliban rang. We would interview people like Benedict Cumberbatch and Joan Rivers, a 40-minute sit-down interview with Tony Blair. I swallowed 10 grams of magic mushrooms cut up. Probably reading Channel 4, The Secrets there. That became the second most complained about moment on British TV that year. George Floyd's sister answers the phone. And so I get the exclusive interview with his sister to get every living Prime Minister to speak together, just from me and my email and my little tricks of telling them.
Today we have Benjamin Butterworth. Benjamin is a journalist, broadcaster, and regular Politico debating current affairs on GB News, Good Morning Britain, and debating the likes of Piers Morgan and more. Ben, welcome to the show.
Nice to see you.
Cool. So first question, I think your whole career and trajectory and what you do going on these various national television shows, I think a lot of people will have absolutely no idea how someone even got started in that and how you made it to where you are now.
Well, I remember when I was about 14 and everyone had to have a check-in with the careers advisor at school. I think for work experience, it's mandatory. And I said to the careers advisor that I wanted to be a social commentator, which with hindsight is the most precocious thing a 14-year-old can ever say. I don't know how I even know what a social commentator was. And she said to me, I don't think that's not a job, sweetie. Well, 15 years later, it's gone pretty well. But I always wanted to be a journalist, and I prefer journalism in terms of finding a story and listening to people and exposing it. That's my first love. But also to share the insight, to have a platform was really important to me. So I started out writing as a journalist when I was 19. I was extremely lucky. My part-time job when I was at LSE as an undergraduate was for Gay Times magazine. And so I would interview people like Benedict Cumberbatch and Joan Rivers and go around the world on travels trips to write stories on a weekend while at university, which was incredibly lucky.
That's cool.
In fact, just right after I finished university, I got a 40-minute sit-down interview with Tony Blair, which, was 10 years ago, actually. And I think about how strange that is for someone that's, weeks out of university. But then I got involved in the Labour Party and I ran the Labour Party's youth wing in London. And people accused me of using that as a platform to get myself a TV career, which is a vicious slur. But needless to say, I did. And so that's when I started getting asked on TV to give my opinions and to talk about the news. And now I've done, God knows how many appearances I've done, but I do well over 100 a year. It could be 200 this year, easily. And so, yeah, I really enjoy it.
That's cool. Okay. Jumping on one thing specifically, your interviews with Benedict Cumberbatch, Tony Blair, and folks like that. And you're around kind of 19 years old at this point?
By that point, I'm probably more like 2021. 2021. I started at 19.
Cool. Okay, that's at like a very young age to do something like that.
Yeah.
How did you feel in terms of, one, confidence, and also two, kind of the journalistic skill of like getting to the heart of the topic?
So it's a really good question. The confidence thing, I find very hard to explain because I didn't have a childhood that suggested that I should have that level of confidence or go out into the world and think that I could do anything. My parents were both heroin addicts. They were in and out of prison. I was born into a council estate in Macclesfield, and then I was taken in by my grandparents during that. But I was bullied heavily at school. I'd say for being gay, they weren't really sure whether I was gay or posh. And then at 17, I said, surprise, I'm both. And, someone threw a brick at my head one day, for example. And so what's very strange is that, and this is the way that I think university can change people's lives, is that I went from being sort of relatively shy, but I suppose maybe because I'd been bullied so much, both at home and at school, there's kind of, it gives you an inner confidence, I guess, that everyone else is wrong and I can do it. So when I moved to London for the London School of Economics, I just transformed into taking every opportunity because it was such a different life to the fairly oppressive one that I'd experienced for the first 18 years. And then, so that's the confidence thing, which is quite strange in my own experience. And I do often reflect now that I'm a few years into my career on how extraordinary it was that I just had the gall to ask the office of Tony Blair for an interview. And maybe often, actually, this is my top journalistic tip, the gall to ask, it's a no if you don't ask, right? It might be a yes if you do ask. That's been true throughout my career. And it's all my best stories have come that way, whether it's Tony Blair or the Taliban. It's just because I tried, and turns out sometimes they answer the phone. About journalism, I really think, and maybe you're an example of this, I think journalism and interviewing and being interested in other people is something that, there's plenty of ways you can get better at it by learning and studying, especially things like the law of what you can say and not say. But ultimately, I think it's a trait that you either are good at or you're not. And it's an interest in the world around you and an interest in other people. So when I worked at Gay Times as my first job, there'd be people in there that were doing journalism degrees as undergraduates. And some of them were just terrible. I mean, they couldn't write, they couldn't think for themselves. And I'd never studied journalism, still never have. But it's that interest in other people that I think goes so far. And you see that now because there's so many great podcasts and YouTube channels. And those people don't call themselves journalists, but what they're doing is journalism. They're telling stories.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that. I really like that. And were there any, particularly in these early interviews, any kind of crash and burn moments or big mistakes that you made?
No, everything was fantastic from... Do you know, I once asked... There's a Katy Perry lyric where she says, I feel like a plastic bag in one of her songs. And I asked Jane McDonald if she's ever felt like a plastic bag. And she just stared at me. And that was horrifically awkward. I interviewed Sophie Ellis-Bextor and then got mugged, so that wasn't ideal. Chiswick is it's the hood. It's dangerous.
What's the story behind the mugging, if you want to talk about it?
Well, I got mugged at the train station after doing it, but she was very kind and she let me redo it. But that was terrifying. So I've always recorded interviews on 2 devices since to avoid something like that. For example, if you lose your dictaphone or something. But the Tony Blair interview... I haven't read it back, so I probably didn't do a very good job because I didn't know what I was doing. But that was very intimidating. He was extremely nice, extremely intelligent. But I remember he kept saying, do you have enough? Do you have enough? Which suggests I wasn't asking very probing questions.
Interesting.
But, you live and learn. And the one thing that I would advise other people to do, but seemingly most people don't, is... to just ask for that interview, because a couple of years ago when the Taliban was taking Afghanistan and I was really getting FOMO because I'm not a foreign reporter, and I was like, why is everyone else getting the stories on the newspaper that I work for? And so I said it was 2 or 3 summers ago now, so I was still working from home, and I said, well, has anyone asked the Taliban? Hey guys, literally they're all guys, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Right? And nowhere was, there were incredibly brave, capable people in Afghanistan, but they hadn't got the Taliban or senior people in the Taliban to answer the questions at this stage. And so I said, look, I know a lot of dodgy people. Just see if I can, 6 degrees of separation, right? Here was that great test. Am I 6 degrees from a leader of the Taliban? Turns out the answer was yes. And so I texted a friend who had interviewed Bashar al-Assad in Syria like a year earlier, and I said, hey, you know Assad, who else do you know? And then he gave me a WhatsApp number for the spokesman for the Taliban, who at this point wasn't talking. And this was the day before they took Kabul, so they hadn't taken Afghanistan, they were in the process.
Yeah, man, this is like a moment in history.
Yeah, exactly. And then I get the WhatsApp of the Taliban, and I keep texting, and no one replies. Like most men, they don't text me back. But I kept trying for days. And then I had a long weekend off. And so it was Thursday night, and I lived in central London, and I had been out drinking at a gay bar, and I'd got home at like 3:30 a.m. And instead of drunk texting my ex, I drunk texted the Taliban. And it turns out 4 a.m. in London is like 9 a.m. in Afghanistan. So it was the start of the working day. No one else was bothering them from the West. And the guy replies, and I run to my living room, and I get a 45-minute exclusive interview with a member of the leadership of the Taliban. It wasn't a great interview in the sense that they're not very honest people. So couldn't really trust anything they were saying, but it was still incredible. And then the first line of the commentary I wrote next to the interview when it went in Saturday's newspaper was I just returned from a gay bar in Soho when the Taliban rang, which is truly a sentence I don't think anybody else can ever write.
So good.
But the lesson of that is that nobody, including the foreign editor of the newspaper, thought they could get the Taliban on the phone. But a bit like 10 years or how many years earlier, when I thought, well, let's just ask Tony Blair, I thought, well, let's just ask the Taliban. And eventually, after days, they did. And now I have the strange situation where occasionally the Taliban send me WhatsApps for, like, a bit like a press office of M&S or something.
That's so funny.
So I woke up one day to this text from the Taliban saying Prince Harry's a disgrace because he'd said in his memoir about killing Taliban soldiers, as they would put it. And it's very odd to get that, but the lesson was the same. I don't know if anyone can train you to do that. It's just about being nosy and being pushy.
That's really interesting. Particularly, I'm really curious about the moment that you first picked
I
up
was
the phone.
I was drunk. Let me tell you, I was really drunk, and nothing sobers you up like the Taliban ringing you. And my flatmate actually texted me, being like, "What are you doing? It's 4 a.m. You've woken me up." And I said, "Excuse me, the Taliban is on the phone." No further questions were asked. And I'd actually ordered fried chicken on Deliveroo or whatever. And so halfway through the call, I have to put the Taliban on hold while I go to the front door to get my chicken, which is just so absurd. And then I sent a message to my news editor saying, "Hey," at 4 or 5 a.m. by that point, and she didn't reply for like most of the next working day. And it's like, this wasn't a drunk message. Like, I'm being serious. I got the Taliban on the phone. So yeah, that happened. And just try, I think.
I like that. Have you got anyone kind of on your hit list that you would really like to do a piece on in some way, similar to the Taliban?
Well, I've always, not comparable to the Taliban, but I've always wanted to interview Hilary Clinton. I really am slightly obsessed with her. And she just released a book, but that was gone. And I think I tried to interview her in the last book and didn't get accepted. And so I think my dream interview would be Hilary Clinton, because she's had the most extraordinary life and she is so wise and so controversial in some parts of the world. I think she'd be my dream person to sit down with and interview.
Is there a particular thing that you'd like to drill down and speak to her about, like a specific area or a specific trait of hers that you would?
I think her durability, because no one has been assaulted more in American public life than Hilary Clinton. She's had, by this point, 35 years of it. And how someone has the steel to keep going and to know that there are people on their side when the people against them are often much louder, even if they might be a smaller number of people. Bearing in mind, she won the popular vote by 3 million in 2016. And so the thing that really fascinates me about her is, how does someone cope with being told they're wrong or being demeaned on such a scale with such furore and still get up and keep going? And in her case, maybe what kept her going was, I want to be the first woman to be president, and it didn't happen. And then she still keeps going, and she does so with, in my view, quite a lot of dignity and self-respect. And I think that's an extraordinary life lesson to take from how somebody copes with that. And you don't need to share her politics, I think, to admire that. And I suspect a lot of entrepreneurs could probably identify with it.
Interesting. I really like that. And now, one of the most popular videos when you search for Piers Morgan on YouTube is your debate with him 4 years ago. I think it's got 11, 12 million plus views.
Well, across different platforms, it's well over 50 million views.
Oh, okay, there we go. Well, can you take us back to that moment, and how did that come about? And was that your first time speaking to him? You'd spoken to him a few different times.
I'd done Good Morning Britain a couple of times before then. And so I'd got the measure of the show. And it's theatre, especially, I've done it since, but it was quite a different show when Piers Morgan co-hosted. Because before you go into the studio for the debate, you don't meet the person you're against. It's just as you walk in. And I noticed, having done it several times with Piers, although obviously you're sat relatively close, not quite this close, but pretty much in the studio during the ad break before you go live, on none of those occasions did he say hello or look at me or the other guest before you went on air. Susanna Reid would say hello and do the niceties. And I realised that was clearly a strategy, right? Because he's a tall man, he's an imposing man, he's obviously incredibly famous, so that's intimidating in itself. And then when he turns and his eyes go on you, it's to really sort of light the fire and intimidate you. By the time that went viral, well, there were two that went viral, super viral, and there was one about whether there were 100 genders. People still come up to me today and they say, do you still believe there's 100 genders? And I say, well, inflation's high, there's 110 now. But the point I was trying to make, what the number was that people use words to identify how they feel and experience the world, and I think that's legitimate, and it's really no great burden on everyone else. Piers Morgan disagreed, and that debate, I mean, it went on for so long in the studio, and then I remember I was trending #1 worldwide on Twitter as he posted about it afterwards, and then someone started a petition to fire Piers Morgan for what he'd said in that interview, which I wasn't involved in. But, well, I'd let you into a secret that Good Morning Britain rang me and asked me if I would argue for the petition on the show to try and recreate that debate, which had already been so popular. And so I went back about a month later and said he should be fired for what he'd said. And that went on for like 13 minutes, which in breakfast television terms is insane. The Prime Minister gets 8 minutes. I think we went straight through the news. They just kept on arguing and arguing. And then that became the second most complained about moment on British TV that year. The most complained about moment was Amanda Holden's breast slipped out on Britain's Got Talent. I was livid. I'd have got mine out if I'd known I would. But yeah, it was extraordinary. But I'll be honest, I do disagree with Piers Morgan on those things, and it was completely real debates. But I think we respected each other because neither of us backed down, and we both understood that it was television, and you want to be animated and get the point across in a way that gets people going. And the secret is that after that, he followed me on Twitter, he gave me his mobile number, and he's been quite helpful career-wise on a couple of occasions. And he wrote about me in his next book. And I said, well, if you're going to write about me, you have to give me an interview. So I did a long interview with him as well. So
that's really cool.
He is a decent person, in a sense that he helps. And the other thing I'd say is that there are lots of these famous presenters that come across as nice, and some of them are absolutely vile. And the secret is that Piers Morgan is really quite pleasant behind the scenes.
That's really interesting. One, the kind of gladiatorial respect that you guys had for each other, really interesting. And two, that's kind of like furthered your career in other ways as well, because that's quite a nice thing to be able to balance, like authentically arguing for what you believe in, but then that also like helping you. That's really cool. Is there anything you would look back on in that moment and say, I would have liked to have done this differently?
Well, for a while I wasn't sure it had been a very good idea, because it gave me a level of exposure that is very hard to get. So I still get people coming up to me fairly routinely asking about that interview, and it is 4.5 years later. People would shout penguin at me in Sainsbury's at one point because he identified as a penguin. They shout penguin at me because he self-identified as a penguin. I said, excuse me, it was Piers was the penguin, I was the other guy. And so for a while I thought, have I humiliated myself? Like, how can I be a serious journalist when this story has gained attraction? It was kind of the start of the transgender debate being mainstream, which Piers Morgan was very good at picking up on, the fact that would be such a talking point in society. His Twitter photo was a penguin for like a year afterwards. And it keeps going viral. I'll scroll through Instagram and see myself, and it's got millions of views. Still, years later, that's happened. So I worried that I wasn't very serious for doing that. But now, it's nice that, I mean, pretty reliably, people don't always recognise me, but if someone mentions it, I mean, I could count on one hand the number of times people don't know what they're referring to with that interview. I mean, very few TV interviews have that kind of reach. And so now I think, I look back at it and that was, what an opportunity, what fun it was. And I got to put across my genuine view, and hopefully that helped some people.
Cool. I really like that. And then to pick up on something around being and feeling like a serious journalist, at what point do you feel like you've hit that?
Ooh, I don't think I do, because you're sort of always trying to get a better story and a bigger story. I mean, something I did maybe a year ago, more than a year ago now, that was the thing I was most happy with, though it didn't have much impact, was so Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who was the British Iranian who was imprisoned in Iran. And the head of MI5, this was about 2 years ago, had said, unprecedented for them to open up about threats in this way, had said that there were 15 people in Britain who had had assassination threats from Iranian Revolutionary Guard on British soil. And one of those was a friend of mine. And so I spent months on this feature where I managed to track down and talk to British people, whether they were Iranian diaspora or prominent Jews in this country, who had had their life threatened in this country, more than Russia. And we know about Salisbury and things, that was massive news, but Iran has done more attempts. And yet it doesn't seem to get the traction, the fear or the notice from politicians and the public. And I spoke to someone who had been sent a disc to their flat where Iran had said, if you don't stop talking about criticising the IRGC, we'll waterboard your dad. And that's what they did to him. Someone who they tried to kidnap him in central London. They tried to drag him into a van. A prominent Jewish person who was told not to walk with your grandkids because they want to abduct them. His whole house now is security like he's a prime minister or something because of the threat. And so I spent months working on that and exposing that. And that's what I'm most proud of, because it took so much effort, and something like assassinations on British soil is incredibly important. And so, yeah, that was something where I felt like a serious journalist. Even the Taliban interview didn't really, because, they were lying, right? So it didn't feel that satisfying. I think the strangest one was during lockdown. So, everyone's going a bit mad and everyone's tied up in their houses. And there had been the Black Lives Matter protests had spread to the UK after the murder of George Floyd. And I interviewed Martin Luther King's son, who is now like 60. And it was like 3 a.m. because he lives, I can't remember in the US, but it was 3 a.m. in London. And I can't get the Skype link to work very well. And so I'm just in my bedroom at 3 a.m. shouting at the computer because, this is the thing, he has the same name as his father. Mm-hmm. So I'm shouting at the computer, Martin Luther King, are you there? Are you there, Martin Luther King? And I'm just thinking my flatmates must be like, he's totally lost it. Mm-hmm. It's like 3 a.m. But that was his name. So that was pretty weird, shouting that. But he was really interesting. And then another one was when Derek Chauvin, the police officer that murdered George Floyd, was convicted. His sister, I had tracked down on her personal Facebook, and she'd responded to a message weeks earlier. And so I don't know whether it's like this now, but you could see notifications once someone replies to a Facebook message. And so when the police officer was convicted and the whole world was trying to speak to them, I'm just sat in London, but I used the Facebook chat phone call button, and George Floyd's sister answers the phone. And so I get the exclusive interview with his sister on how she feels about the conviction just by using Facebook chat to ring her. And as I do it, she's clearly in a fried chicken place and she's shouting about fried chicken and mashed potato. I'm like, hello. And then once she'd finished ordering her meal, she gave me the most beautiful interview, and it was the front page of the paper and led the British news cycle on that story the next day. Mm-hmm. And so that I was quite proud of that because it felt significant. And she said, rise up in George's name to British people. And it, impacted some of the protests that were happening. So I was quite satisfied with that because it had a sort of social good. And then I suppose the one other one is 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. It was the 50th anniversary of the first Pride March in this country. And it was going to go totally unnoticed. People had forgotten and not clocked this. And first of all, I interviewed some of the people that were so brave in 1972 to go on that march. And of course, terrifying. It's just been decriminalised, homosexuality, but actually violence against people perceived to be gay has gone through the roof. with that extra awareness. So I did that. And then
Sorry, jumping in on that, the stat you're saying, violence against what was that?
against gay people or people perceived to be gay, because when
That had gone through the roof in
Yeah.
1972.
well,
around-
because when it was decriminalised, people didn't really, before that, you see this in a lot of countries. People don't really know that gays exist, right? And then once people start, they protest and the laws come in, well, it creates a moral panic often. It creates an awareness. And so, the life for a lot of gay people got worse. Not that there were many out gay people, but it got worse for a while. So these people in that environment that went on that created the first Pride March in the UK were incredibly brave and amazing stories. So I interviewed these people, and then I just felt that, is there any social cause where attitudes have changed as radically as gay rights in a generation or two? And so I took that, and then I set myself the goal, which no one believed I could do, but to interview, to speak to every living prime minister, to get them to praise those people, to say that what you'd done was incredible and that we were wrong in some cases. And there were 6 prime ministers at that point. We've had about 50 since. The sitting prime minister was Boris Johnson. Turned out, as luck would have it, I didn't even know this, that I was friends with a press officer for him in the civil service. How discreet he was, because he never mentioned that was his job. But when I sent the email to the office and he replied, I was like, oh, that's very helpful. So Boris Johnson was easy to get. Tony Blair I already knew. The hardest was John Major. But I told him, look, all your friends have done it.
Strong. I really like that approach.
I tell you what, I'll be honest. I went to each of them saying all the others have done it. Because they all, obviously some of them don't like the others, right? And so my strategy was, I went to Theresa May's person first, and I said, well, David Cameron's done it. He hadn't. But I was like, Theresa May will not want to do it if David Cameron's done it. Like, she'll want to be involved. And then once I'd got those two, David Cameron was easy to get, actually. I went to John Major and said, well, do you really want the story to be that you didn't do it? And then they sent it, and they were very helpful.
Why do you think John Major was the hardest to reach?
Just because he's not really involved.
Oh, right. He's just so... Yeah. Gotcha.
And he didn't say what I wanted him to say, but there we go. And then Gordon Brown, I said, well, Tony Blair's done it. So, they obviously hate each other, right? Or that's the public perception. And anyway, that's how I managed to convince every Prime Minister to write for the 50th anniversary about their admiration for these ordinary activists and for the change in LGBT rights. And I was so impressed with Theresa May. She was by far my favourite, because she acknowledged that she used to be on the other side of that argument. And she said I was wrong. And, I'm so glad that these people won the argument and that the British establishment moved to support this equality. So I was really proud of that. And when the front page came out, and with all of them on there, it felt like a real moment. It's so hard to get a Prime Minister to say anything. They're right at the top of the tree. To get every living Prime Minister to speak together for one occasion, just from me and my email and my little tricks of telling them that, the rest of the playground is doing it. I was really proud of that.
Nice. I really like that. That's
Yeah, there's the trick. Tell play off how much they hate each other.
It's really cool. And a key, no pun intended, like moment of pride for you as well.
Yeah.
Working on that.
Yeah, it was. It really was. And also, bear in mind, at this point, there was a lot of pushback, and there still is. Well, it's kind of faded with the Labour government, but on trans people and stuff. And so, when companies are backing out of, sponsoring events or equality stuff within their workplaces, to get every Prime Minister, that sets a tone that people in the economy pick up on, business picks up on, civil society picks up on. And so that's why I thought it was really impactful, a statement that we're not going backwards, right? Nothing's more establishment than a Prime Minister. And they're saying this is the way Britain is and we're proud of it. So I hoped that, there were people in boardrooms and stuff that acknowledged that, and that it had some tangible use in the direction of the debate.
So have you had any mentors or mentor-like figures who have given you advice on this journey and trajectory you've been on?
When I was much younger, someone called Matthew Doyle, who is now Director of Communications at Number 10, was very helpful, before my career really took off, because he's so good at the media and so wise. So when I was sort of university age, he was always very generous with his time, and I appreciated that. I've actually found it quite difficult in recent years because it's such a peculiar career, to make a living having arguments on television, but not want to be a sort of real housewife. And so I have found it difficult.
Wait, I didn't follow that phrasing. What does that mean?
A real housewife?
Yeah.
Well, you don't watch Real Housewives?
No, I
Dynasty?
don't. No, it completely went over my head.
It's basically a load of sort of rich women in America or Britain, depending on the episodes, who scream at each other for a living. So, I don't want to be like that, right? I still want to be a journalist.
Is it like the Oprah Winfrey panel kind of thing?
More like Jerry Springer, I would say.
Okay.
So, I don't really like screaming at people on television as a job. I like to sort of be a bit more informed, but I found it quite hard because, there's not many people that do this line. The newspaper I work for, nobody else does this. And so actually that's been one of the difficulties. When you're treading a path that's not so common, then who are your mentors and who are you helping you? Someone that did is a woman called Julia Hartley-Brewer, who is polar opposite politics, but she's been extremely successful at becoming a well-known journalist and commentator and presenter. And so she's been very generous to me in helping. But I dare admit that because, we definitely don't agree on anything else.
That's really cool. I do really admire this aspect of you having positive relationships with people on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum, or not maybe the complete opposite.
Yeah, complete opposite.
No,
yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah, that's funny. And to flip the question a little bit now, putting you more in the kind of mentor role, if you could speak to yourself, 10 years ago, what advice would you give to help someone to break into journalism?
Well, I mean, things are quite different now. They've changed really quickly with technology. And I actually think things are better now because certainly a few years ago, it felt like journalism in a serious form was disappearing because traditional newspapers, the circulation was falling and you hadn't yet had the rise of their digital output. The Times, for example, is more profitable than it has been in a very long time because it has so many digital subscribers. And you've seen places like BuzzFeed have disappeared, and traditional outlets, New York Times is making a fortune, more than it's ever made, I think, as is the Spectator magazine and The Economist. So journalism is actually in a better funding model now than it was because it's found a way into this new world. And I think for someone trying to get involved in that, it's better now because the ability to go and post videos and investigate things and then share what you find on your own platform means that you can prove yourself without anybody having to open the door. And the thing that for a long time in journalism was that those doors were closed, especially to people that weren't from networks where dad already worked for the newspaper, right? I mean, that's how it worked for decades, so far as I can tell. And that's different now because the gatekeepers are gone. It's democratized. The internet has meant that whether it's, TikTok or YouTube or a Substack where you sort of subscribe to people's content, that now people can put their work out there. And there are so many examples where that leads into traditional outlets, with the kind of massive resources to do big stories. There's a woman called Isabel Young, who is a Vice journalist or was a Vice documentary maker. And her reports are just incredible. And now she's I'm sure that's already an excellent job, but she's now at CNN. And I think it's those kind of routes that are possible. And for me, I only got a foot in the door because of my Twitter, right? I wouldn't have known any of these people in a magazine or a newspaper if it weren't for drawing attention on Twitter. And that's led, 10, 13 years of a career. So, I definitely think just be a self-starter because people will take notice. And the other bit I'd say is that even though it feels like all the doors are closed and there's some really rubbish people in journalism that are just posh, actually newspapers and outlets are desperate for talent. It's really not that common. And so if you're good, you'll be surprised at how far and how fast you go. I don't know how good I am, but things took off pretty quickly once people knew I existed. So get to people know you exist.
That's really cool. And what kind of advice would you give around the kind of theatrics, gladiatorial, debating side of it as well?
Well, the truth is I make more money from TV and radio than I do from writing. Certainly per hour, it's considerably more. And so, if you want to make a good income, then that is the way to do it. But at the same time, a lot of those TV stations, I think, are on the wane, TV news, although there's so many of them now. And so YouTube loves theatrics. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, Benjamin destroys
Yeah,
X, Y, and Z.
exactly. However, I do think that the proper money isn't in the journalism, as they call it, of just constantly saying crazy things to an ever dwindling return. I think it's in offering quality. Quality news outlets are striving, frankly. So many websites that just need constant clicks to see the little ads around them. The money they make compared to £5 a month subscriber, the latter is a much more reliable business model. And you see these people now that, YouTube's been around for long enough, these people that say crazy things, and 10 years in, they're kind of struggling in some cases.
That's a good
So, for whatever, don't blow your shot straight away, right? Don't just be crazy for the sake of it, because it may well work at the start. But if you want a career, I'm not sure how sustainable that is.
That's really interesting. And then where do you see your career going? Not in the more in like the long term. Are there any kind of like key milestones you might want to hit, or maybe just one key milestone that you'd really like to hit in your career?
Well, I would like to write a book or two. I love travel, and I love dangerous travel. This year I've been to Lebanon, to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan, and most dangerous of all, to Bulgaria. And that's a joke. Please don't, Bulgarian
Bulgarian
internet,
news.
don't hate me. But I like that because I like seeing the world through other people's eyes. There's so many different ways to experience the world. And the way we experience it in a place like London is not how most people experience it. And so I'd love to write a book about that. I'd love to do a memoir, and I've got an agent and discuss that, but it's a very hard thing to reflect on your own life. And I'd love to be a radio presenter. But the difficulty about all these things is that people have to like you, and that's quite, that's quite nerve-wracking. They don't like me, I won't get anywhere. But those are things I'd like to do. Yeah. And also they pay really well. So,
Classic.
as a millennial, I can't afford a house or a printer, so I'd like to afford those two things.
What resources do you consume on a regular basis?
Do you mean like news resources?
Yeah. How do you build? What resources do you consume to build your worldview or to critique your worldview?
Well, I do read a lot, but I don't really read books, which makes me sound a little bit thick. But I read loads of news, and it doesn't feel like a chore because I enjoy it. But I really love magazines, and maybe that makes me look like an old millennial, but the kind of variety of features, in-depth investigations that you get, whether it's GQ or Tatler or Sunday Times magazine, I find those kind of publications really good because I often love sort of crazy investigations where people do something bizarre. But I read the newspapers and I read magazines a lot, and I find that extremely helpful. But I think it's really important to read people that you don't agree with. So I read The Spectator. Yeah, I'm not right wing, but I find it so interesting because it's really well informed and it gives you a sense of context to your own views. But the other thing is that travel is a real resource for that, because nothing flips your worldview on its head like going to somewhere that feels like another world and questioning yourself. And I think that's, it's not the most accessible thing to do for some people, but travel and listening to people in other countries is definitely the thing that has the biggest impact.
And then on that, and maybe a tough question, maybe not, what in your view in the last 3-4 years has been your biggest change of opinion?
Well, I mean, I'm an unabashed social democrat, hence why I like Tony Blair. And so there's a lot of flexibility in that in the first place. So being a radical moderate, as I joke. Do you know, the one thing that I'm obsessed with is just build things, for God's sake. I mean, when you go to Dubai, for example, I don't know if you've been.
Not yet.
But I mean, like, everything is going up everywhere, right? And I'm not saying Dubai is the ultimate place in the world, because culturally it's rather lacking, and obviously some of its laws are pretty prohibitive. But they build stuff, and there's an economy, and it's fueled, and it's expanding. And I just look at Britain and London, and I'm like, will you stop moaning that you can't see the golf course? Like, yes, every building I see, I say put 4 more stories on it. We've got so many. I think we need something like 2 million homes in this country to catch up with demand. We've built half as many as France in the last 50 years, right? And France has almost exactly the same population as the UK. and it's cost a bomb to rent anything, let alone to buy anything in most parts of London, of Bristol, of Manchester, of Edinburgh. It's spreading. So the thing that I've become obsessed with is we just build some bloody houses, right? And I don't care. And that is the Labour government's view, and I'm quite relieved about that. And then the other thing, a view where I'm kind of proud it's not changed, is that as I've been lucky enough to make more money, I don't complain about my taxes. I was so proud when I became an additional rate taxpayer. And, now I feel like I can speak with authority on that, because I'm not just on, 20k, having the easy job of saying, oh, you should pay more. The only thing I would caveat that with is that I think there is such a generational divide, because once you take in my student loan repayments, which are £600 to £800 a month, and that's insane, okay? That's more, it's probably the same as most people's mortgages in this country, who live outside London and are 20 years older than us. And that's just what I pay on student loan repayments. And I feel like anybody over the age of 40 doesn't seem to realise how heavy the burden is. Once you take rent and income tax and then student loan repayments, there's so little money left for a generation of people to get any security, to pursue their entrepreneurial goals, to set up businesses, to buy a home, to have the resource to start a family. And I think there's just an incredible generational divide on that makes me really, really angry. When they talk about spoiled millennials having their lattes, well, yeah, it's about the only satisfaction we can have. But also, 30 years ago, you were all smoking 20 a day, which probably costs more than lattes. So who are you to lecture?
So coming towards the end of the questions, a slightly fluffier question is, how would you like to be perceived as a public figure?
Do you know, so many people, I was filming something in a pub last week, and the landlady, after a morning filming, whose pub they'd hired, she said, I really don't like you on television, but
So funny.
But you're quite nice in real life. And I just thought, God, I'm really not trying to be a tosser on TV, but you can't overthink it too much, right? And actually, I mean, that's the thing, right? When I go to, I'm on the rare occasion someone would invite me to a party, people tend to start out, if they've seen anything I've done on telly or whatever, or Twitter, not that I really use Twitter these days, but they tend to like me in real life and not on television. And the thing is, television it's entertainment. The job is to have a strong opinion. Especially if you argue for a living, people think you're really argumentative and you argue all day long. And I don't think I'm like that. If people try and start an argument with me, or ask me a political view, often I'll just say, you have to pay me a fee first. Otherwise,
That's pretty good. I like that.
And so I don't worry about it too much. I get so much abuse. I tweeted a picture. I went for dinner at this new restaurant called Home Kitchen, which employs the homeless, but it's run by a Michelin star chef. And I posted a picture, and someone was like, "Oh, I bet they made a fortune off that fat lefty." And I'm like, "Is there any need?" But you can't take those things seriously, because what miserable weirdo is typing that from the basement, right?
Oh, there's an interesting question. Is, have you, in your various tweets or online presence, ever tweeted or written something or posted something that you look back on and you're like, oh, you know what? I really wish I hadn't said that. Either because you disagree with it, or you're just like, that was a bit, facile or immature.
I mean, when a woman called Teresa Coffey became health secretary, I did ask whether it was appropriate to have a cigar-smoking overweight person telling the country how to live healthily. And that got quite a large response. It was also, this question was put by Loose Women and put by Radio 4. So I don't think it was an illegitimate question, that someone who was famously unhealthy should be in charge of their health service. But she didn't last very long in that job. So thankfully it passed by. But it got a strong reaction. I thought, someone's weight isn't a reflection on their intelligence, which is kind of what I was saying without meaning it. I meant, are they an appropriate role model? But is the health secretary a role model? Not really. They're just in charge of a very important piece of the state. So I think that probably wasn't the wisest thing to say. And I think I did meet Teresa Coffey at one thing, but she didn't know who I was at this point, or she didn't let on. So, but I think I would have apologised if she'd asked.
Gotcha. And throughout this conversation, a lot of the various things that have happened, they've been like 3 a.m. phone calls with the Taliban,
Yeah.
or early mornings on TV. How do you find your kind of weekly schedule, or is there structure to the way that you work, or is it a little bit by its very nature responsive?
No, I think the reason I go to countries like Yemen or Lebanon is because I like to be in countries less stable than I am. It's all a bit, it's not quite chaotic because it's not that busy, in the sense that like there's no minute to spare, there is, but it's unpredictable. Yeah. So, someone will drop out and then it's a 4 a.m. taxi to go and do Sky News at breakfast the next day. But I like that. I think the important thing is to have a calm home. I found that really helpful. Chaos at home, I can't cope with. It really ruins everything. So I always have classic FM on at home, and try and be very calm. That's where I get my stability from. But the rhythm of a working week is different every week. Mm-hmm. And I think actually that's something to be grateful for, because when I was at uni and at sixth form, I worked in a call centre, and I mean, every call is exactly the same. And I think that's a really hard life. And so to have your mind stimulated and a variety of things to do, I think is a massive privilege in a career.
Cool. I like that. And now, thinking about yourself in 10 years' time, what do you think the future version of yourself would look back and advise you?
It's a really good question, because we kind of started with this, which is that I can't understand me 10 years ago. How did I think I was so fantastic? Because 10 years later, I don't know if this happens with everybody with age, but I'm so aware of all my flaws. I guess that's when life tests you. You see the things that you pass and the things that you fail at. Mm-hmm. And I'm more insecure now in some ways than I was 10 years ago. I think I was too optimistic to be insecure 10 years ago. Whereas now you start to think, there's only, I can only go so far. And I think so that's why I'm not sure what I'd say in 10 years' time. Because I'm trying really hard to make that person in 10 years' time not be the person I am right now. Because right now I feel very tested. And so I don't have the confidence I had at the start of my career.
When you say tested,
yeah,
what do you mean?
Well, you get these great jobs and then you lose them in some cases. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's just inevitable. But that's really hard to deal with, because you've only ever been up. And then once things start to go wrong, and once your flaws start to become obvious in some cases, and you have to try and fix them, but maybe they started in childhood, that's really hard. And I think, is that what happens once you get to your 30s? Is that why people talk about ending up in a midlife crisis? Because, I've certainly spoken to people older where, that's what manifests into thinking, I've always thought this was my identity. And then actually now I've run aground and I can't do it. So I'm trying really hard to make the person in 10 years still be as optimistic, because when I turned 30, I made a mental decision to take more risks and be much braver than I had been. So whether that's going to Yemen or going to Baghdad, as I am fairly soon, or, experimenting with all sorts of things. I did magic mushrooms.
We should talk about that before
it
finishes. Yeah.
I did. Channel 4 approached me for this program where they took people with opposite political views and then gave them a load of hallucinogenic drugs to see whether they end up agreeing, called Higher Ground. And so having never done a hallucinogenic drug before, I took in cacao, like a hot chocolate, I swallowed 10 grams of magic mushrooms cut up.
And 10 grams is a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a hero dose, apparently.
Yeah, heroic dose.
I don't know, it's like 1 or 2 grams what someone might do recreationally.
Yeah. So, and sometimes a little bit less. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. But 1 or 2 grams is like recreational. Let's go to a club. Let's go walk around, kind of thing. Maybe you do like 3 to 5 if you wanted something a bit harder. But like if you did more than 5 or 6, you'd be like, I'm gonna sit on a couch, put headphones in, and meditate or something.
So that's what happened. Yeah. So we were with these sort of Buddhists in the Netherlands, where the show actually said we did something else, but we did magic mushrooms, but they said we did something else because it was the other thing that was legal. So it was probably revealing Channel 4 secrets there. But what we actually did was mushrooms. And we lay on beds and people were playing music around us. And I mean, I didn't know what to expect, but I did it precisely because I was so scared. Like, the idea of losing complete control in the way that a trip like that takes it from you was my worst nightmare. So I thought, well, if that's your worst nightmare, you've got to do it, right? Because otherwise you're living with boundaries. And, are you really living if you do the same thing and experience the same thing every day? But it was crazy. It was like bedknobs and broomsticks at the start when everything turns into a cartoon. And then it lasted for about 9 hours, but it felt like weeks and weeks. And the music you could see and feel, and the colours and everything was just like nothing else I've ever experienced. And it had, I wasn't depressed, but it had a massive impact on my mental health for the positive. And some of the other people that did that program, it changed their lives. I returned to being a nightmare just a few weeks later, but I returned to being a nightmare just a few weeks later, but other people really benefited. But yeah, doing the magic mushrooms was an example of that, of taking those risks. And so I've done lots of that since. I went to Nepal and canoed with crocodiles.
That's cool.
Yeah, and the boat is just hollowed out tree. So, the boat is a little higher in the water than the crocodile next to you. And then watching sunrise over Everest was amazing. I went last year to live with the Mentawai tribe, which is one of the last authentic hunter-gatherer tribes in the world that live deep in this island in the Indian Ocean. And I got a guide to take me in there, and I chopped wood and ate the wood and ate maggots for protein.
What did the maggots taste like?
They tasted of trees, which they live in. It wasn't an exciting taste, but like you have to rip the head off and eat the rest while it's wriggling in your mouth.
So cool.
And these guys walk around with enormous machetes. They have no concept of the rest of the world in some cases. Their language is their tribal tongue, which the tour guide is kind of exaggeration, the guy that could speak a bit of language with them. So that was, 5 days, in a jungle with a tribe that rarely sees outside people eating maggots. And I'm doing these things on purpose because otherwise, no offense to the heterosexual community, but in particular, like at 25, every straight bloke needs a girlfriend, and then they're like, oh, we have to get a kid and a flat, I guess. And then they've got about 4 friends, half of them, from work that they don't even like, and they go to the pub. And I just think, I don't want to live like that. I'm not like to turn heterosexual, but that is a way of life that a lot of people settle into, and I don't want to be like that. So I want to keep having experiences, and so I think you have to be conscious. So I just hope that that's still there in 10 years, that the benefits of taking risks are that I still feel alive and not some miserable 40-year-old bloke, of which there are millions.
Yeah, true that. There's that famous quote around, most people are living lives of quiet desperation.
Yes, mine is loud desperation.
Yeah. And on that, in terms of quotes, do you have a favourite quotation that you like?
Well, I think it has to be the Pogues in Fairy Tale of New York, where there's the lyric, I could have been somebody, well, so could anybody. And I really like that because...
Not the scumbag you maggot.
No. That was applicable, but it's not the favourite quote. Because I could have been anybody, well, so could... I could have been somebody, well, so could anybody. Because you get so many people that pretend, that say, oh, I could have done this if I tried. Well, why didn't you try? And it's sort of, there's an optimism and a depression in that quote, right? And it just reminds me that to keep pushing. And also all those people that are putting you down or pretending, well, you could have done it, but you didn't. And I think that's a great quote.
Perfect. Okay. Really strong note to end on. Really appreciate your time, man.